He didn't rise from the dead. Everybody in Jerusalem knows that, but our eyewitness accounts were written close enough to the actual events. And guess what? Nobody said, you're fibbing. More details on the nearness of the accounts. A myth cannot be developed when people who can refute it are still alive.
Well, I mean, this assumes a few things. One, that there weren't people that were saying that this is horseshit. We don't know if there were or weren't people saying that it was all horseshit. We definitely know that there were at least people making arguments against the Christians by the 80s. So, I mean, we do know that. Saying that a myth cannot develop when people can still refute it, I mean, that's refuted by our current socio-political environment right now. We have ways of refuting election fraud, but people are still believing in it. So to suggest that a myth cannot develop when there are people to refute it, I think is just horseshit. And you can look at any of the other things that I mentioned, like the cargo cults, that was easily refutable, but people still believed it. Ned Ludd, there were people around that could have refuted that, but they didn't, and instead they believed it. And then, you know, you have the various things that are definitely fictional from the past, where, you know, people could have refuted it. Either they didn't, or people believed it even though they were proven wrong. So this point number one right here doesn't really make a lot of sense, and he doesn't provide any kind of citations on where he's getting this from or anything like that. If you look at actual studies on myth and how they propagate through their cultures and everything like that, I feel like you would definitely find contrary evidence to what this number one point is trying to make.
Number two, many witnesses were still alive when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians in about AD 55, give or take.
So for that number two right there, he's saying that there were many witnesses still alive. Basically, that's just Paul saying that many of these people are still alive, although some have died, is what he says right there. And you can't tell me who he's talking about. Like, you can't give me names. You can't give any kind of meaningful information where I would be able to, like, try to find any information on these people. The only time they're mentioned is vaguely in this particular part of 1 Corinthians. So, or 1 Corinthians, however you say it. This doesn't actually prove that there were actually many witnesses. It just shows that there were claims of many witnesses. But just because people believe there were a lot of witnesses doesn't mean there actually were witnesses. Like, if I were to say right now that, oh, hey, look, guys, Saturday night, Meatloaf is going to play a concert in Huntsville, Alabama. I know he's dead, hun. That's the reason why I picked him. Let's say last night there was a Meatloaf concert in Huntsville, Alabama. 500 people attended it. We all saw Meatloaf live on stage singing, I would do anything for love, but I won't do that. No. Meatloaf is on stage singing it. 500 people in Huntsville, Alabama saw it. Find those 500 people. Right? I mean, you should be able to, right? I mean, it doesn't matter where you're at in the world. There are people watching right now that are probably from North Alabama. Go find those 500 people. And if you can't find those 500 people, does that mean that those 500 people don't exist? That 500 people didn't witness Meatloaf singing that he would do anything for love? That's true, honey. 500 people didn't. But my point is that at that point in time, you would not be able to find these 500 witnesses that are unnamed. Paul doesn't give us any kind of indication of where they were when they saw Jesus. So there would be no way. Like, I gave more information about Ghost Meatloaf singing his song in Huntsville, Alabama than Paul gives in this little shitty statement in 1 Corinthians.
3, many witnesses were still alive when Paul wrote Galatians in AD 49.
I don't know what he's talking about here. Paul does not mention any witnesses. He doesn't indicate anybody is a witness. He talks about Cephas and James, one of the pillars, but those were just people that received visions of Jesus. So they're not eyewitnesses of him resurrecting from the dead. They're just people who had hallucinations. So this point right here is just false. Like, it's, I'm not going to say that he's lying about it, but if he were to try to spin Galatians to be about eyewitnesses or witnesses in general, I would definitely say that that's disingenuous, because he knows that that's not what Paul says.
He certainly talks about Christ rising from the dead. Number 4, A myth requires 2 or more generations to pass before it can take root.
I don't like where does this come off? A myth requires 2 or more generations to pass before it can take root. Where in the fuck does this come from? All it takes is the ignorance of people and not knowing like everything that happened in the first century. I mean, just think about it. If you're walking around the 70s and you have some fuck saying that like 40 years ago somebody died for your sins, I mean, how are you going to verify that? In fact, I feel like this guy gets a lot of things backwards in this entire video, but in this particular part, what I feel like he gets backwards is actually that myth can propagate faster in a time when people aren't connected, when the literacy rate is abysmal, like near nothing, at least compared to what the literacy rate is now. Myth would be able to propagate much faster, and it would be able to take root quicker at that point in time than now. Because you think about it, right now, we have people that are spreading myths about, well, for one thing, election fraud. And then you've got other things like the anti-vax stuff. That's something new that I haven't talked about yet instead of the election fraud stuff. The anti-vax stuff, that stuff has been around for multiple years and it still hasn't gone away. In fact, it's actually grown since COVID. Yeah, I wish we could go back to the time when we would laugh at anti-vaxxers and blame them for like diseases.
And finally, number 5, the best scholarship suggests the synoptic gospels were written within 30 years of Calvary.
That's the most conservative date, because if you figure that Jesus was supposedly crucified in the early 30s, the earliest date for like Mark's gospel being 65, that's relatively within that 30-year margin that he's talking about. But a closer approximation to it would be 40 years, right around 40 years plus or minus some years. I mean, we don't have exact dates for any of this, but also I don't know what this has to do with being able to trust Christianity. Myths can definitely develop in shorter amounts of time. Even by his conservative estimate here, the UFO scene, like the UFO, that whole community popped up in 20 years. How can you seriously think that myths and false information can't take root before the 30-year mark right here, which is an incorrect number, but still, even using his number, it's ridiculous.
All that to say, the people who wrote these accounts claim to have seen them.
Big whoop-de-fucking-do. I really don't care if they claim to have seen anything. I can claim to see a big dick dinosaur flying in the sky, but that doesn't mean that one exists.